Welcome back. This is part two of the lecture about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let me just pull up my slides and we will get going. All right. So in the first part of this lecture, we talked about the factors that were contributing to the collapse of or the demise of the Soviet Union, economic factors, their overspending on the military and nuclear weapons, and the negative impacts or the policies that Gorbachev put in place, glasnost and perestroika, that were soon to have negative impacts on the Soviet Union. So now we're going to talk about really the end of the Eastern Bloc and the end of the Soviet Union. So in the early 1980s, something pretty monumental happens in Poland, and that is the creation and the growth of something called the Solidarity movement. Solidarity was a workers' union, and what's important about it is that it was independent from the Communist Party. So up until this point in the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union, all workers' unions had been basically run by the Communist Party. And so the Solidarity was one that was not affiliated with the Communist Party. It was independent in that regard. And so the mere fact that it existed was kind of a big deal. But then in Poland, it started to gain a ton of momentum. Millions of workers started joining this workers' union and taking to the streets, like you can see in the photo, to go on strike or to practice acts of civil disobedience, like protests and stuff like that, to show their support for the workers' union. This worker solidarity movement, workers' union, just grows and grows throughout the 1980s, and eventually they will win political control. I'll talk about that in a second. So it was clear that even in the beginning of the 1980s, the Soviet Union's grip on the Eastern Bloc countries was starting to loosen, because the fact that something like this could exist. If the Solidarity movement had started in like the 60s or the 70s when Brezhnev was in charge, it couldn't have existed. He would have shut it down. He would have used the military to take it out. But under Gorbachev's rule, things were a little bit more loose because of those reforms that he had created. And it was a clear indication that this was something different for the Soviet Union. Things were going to start to change in relationship between the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries or the Eastern Bloc countries. At this point in time, the United States starts to very openly advocate for the end of the repressive regimes in the Eastern Bloc. The American President Ronald Reagan, who oftentimes gets a lot of credit for ending the Cold War, because he so openly supported the beginning of democracies and the beginnings of freedom in the Eastern Bloc, went to Berlin. He went to West Berlin. And he's standing there with the Brandenburg Gate, which was the border between East and West Berlin, with the wall sort of behind him. He gives this very famous speech that today is known as the Tear Down This Wall speech, in which he addresses Mikhail Gorbachev directly. Obviously, Gorbachev wasn't actually there, but the speech's intended audience is the people of West Berlin and Gorbachev. And Reagan basically says, look, Gorbachev, if you want the Soviet Union to progress, if you want it to become a better place, you need to lift these restrictions. You need to stop the oppression. And then, of course, the big tagline is Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And it's the sound bite that gets heard around the world, and people are cheering. They're all like, yes, yes, yes. So check out this video. It's a very short clip of that moment, and you can kind of get the feeling of the energy and the momentum that was starting to build in Europe and in the Soviet Union during this time period. So following that, in 1989, a lot of stuff starts happening. Across the Eastern Bloc, there are tons of revolutions that are referred to as the revolutions of 1989. Sometimes this period is referred to as the Fall of Nations. They actually use that term because in 1848, in the 1848 revolutions, they had referred to that time period as the Spring of Nations. They were springing into being, and we know that that's what was happening in 1848. And in 1989, it's the Fall of Nations, right? All of these Eastern Bloc governments that are basically puppet governments of the Soviet Union are starting to fall. So in places across the Eastern Bloc, their communist authoritarian governments are slowly but surely sort of being replaced with democracies because of citizens taking to the streets and protesting and things like that. In Poland, they had the first sort of partially free elections in the Eastern Bloc, which is a big deal. And in those elections, Solidarity, which was that trade union, they win majorities in those elections. And so they are like a political party that is not the Communist Party. So that's a huge step for Poland, and then for other countries in the Eastern Bloc, they start to follow suit as well. Um, in Hungary, the Hungarians had constructed their own wall because what was happening in the the 60s is, without a wall, a lot of Hungarians were basically escaping into Western Europe, and so Hungary had constructed their own wall to keep everyone in. And so the Hungarian wall starts to fall, and people from Hungary start to go, like, leave. Basically, they leave the Eastern Bloc. They're getting out because obviously it's not very nice to live there. And people from other parts of the Eastern Bloc are going into Hungary so that they can escape out. So it was pretty clear, like, the whole structure was starting to crumble, like the literal structure, like the wall, but also the political structure that had existed for so many years in the Eastern Bloc was starting to fall. Country after country, Eastern Bloc countries start to opt out essentially of the Warsaw Pact and change over their governments to democracies or parliament systems type of thing. So it's a big deal. Here we have a couple of photos from the Eastern Bloc. This is part of the Berlin Wall. And on the wall it says Danke Gorby, which is like, thank you Gorbachev, right? Because this is really what we can see was the end result of Glasnost and Perestroika, that Gorbachev opened the door for all of these reforms and larger scale sort of like revolutions to take place, which ended up allowing the Eastern Bloc countries their freedom. Here we have, this is the leader of Solidarity in Poland. His name is Lech, I'm probably saying this wrong, but Lech Walesa. And here he is after winning his victory in the 1989 elections with the American president, George H.W. Bush. So it's a big moment. And it's very clear, like, that the United States is going to be in support of all of these countries that are trying to push for their freedom, for their democracies, and for their, better lives, essentially. Another thing to mention about 1989, thinking about it in the larger, like, historical context, is these revolutions of 1989 were not limited to the Eastern Bloc countries. There were also significant revolution or rebellions, I guess, in communist China. And this, the most famous of which is taking place in Tiananmen Square. And this is, the similar thing happening, but in China, right? The civilians protesting and advocating for greater freedoms and liberties. This is probably one of the most iconic photos of the 80s. It's taken at Tiananmen Square, like rebellions or protests, and it's a Chinese civilian standing in front of a tank. And of course, it's like the ultimate symbol of, like, the citizen versus the state. It's clear, obviously a tank could roll over and crush and kill this guy if it wanted to, but will it, right? It's, will the government crush individual citizens like this? The Tiananmen Square protests did not end well. A lot of civilians were killed by the government, and the Chinese Communist government did not, like, change over to a democracy like a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries were. So a similar sentiment in communist China, but not the same results. Following the 1989 revolutions, with all of these Eastern Bloc countries breaking away from the Soviet Union, many people would consider the fall of the Berlin Wall to be the end of the Cold War, because the Berlin Wall had come to represent so much of what the Cold War was about, that clear dividing line between the East and the West. On November 10th, 1989, the East German government said that they were going to start taking parts of the wall down. They announced that they would not prevent people from East Berlin going into West Berlin and vice versa. And so, East German bulldozers come and start taking down parts of the wall, but then, like, regular civilians are coming out there with, like, their sledgehammers and what have you, to physically rip apart the wall. East Berliners and West Berliners are reunited. They're popping champagne. They're partying on top of the wall. It's a very celebratory, happy mood. This clip is the American broadcaster, or the American news anchor, Peter Jennings. And he's broadcasting live from November 10th, 1989. And you can kind of just get a sense of the energy behind this time period. So it was very clear, like, the Cold War was coming to an end. It was like the long, slow burn for the Soviet Union, which was taking place. So with that, with the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union itself starts to fall apart. different republics or like states basically within the Soviet Union start to declare their independence throughout 1990 and 1991, until at the end of 1991, there's literally no Soviet Union left because each of the states within the Union has declared their independence. So there's literally no Union. Um, and so both of these political cartoons place a lot of that blame / responsibility on Gorbachev. Here we have him standing in front of, the symbol of communism, the hammer and the sickle, but of course they're all broken apart into little pieces, and it's clear he doesn't necessarily have a plan for how to put it back together again. This one over here is making sort of a play on Humpty Dumpty. If you're not familiar with it, the children's nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. In the nursery rhyme, he's this like giant egg who sits on a wall and he falls over and he breaks, right? Once an egg breaks, you can't really put it back together. Here, Gorbachev is being pictured as Humpty Dumpty, as the egg, right? And he's sitting on top of the wall. He's a little unsteady, and the wall itself represents the Soviet Union. And you can see that the wall is starting to break, right? The Soviet Union is breaking sort of out from under him, which the artist is sort of implying is going to lead to the fall of Gorbachev, right? Literally in the drawing, but also like metaphorically the political fall of Gorbachev. And that's exactly what ends up happening when the Soviet Union splits apart and ceases to exist. On December 25th, 1991, he also resigned his position as leader of the Soviet Union because there literally was no more Soviet Union. And this guy, Boris Yeltsin, takes over Russia, which they'll talk about more in chapter 30. And so you have a number of sort of countries that are like relatively new countries, and they have some of their own challenges, which again, we'll talk about more in chapter 30, but essentially with the end of the Soviet Union is the end of the Cold War, because without the Soviet Union, there is no other superpower for the United States to be competing with. So it's kind of anticlimactic, I guess, but it's also like a big moment. Like this is the end of a big chapter in world history, in European history, and it's definitely a big deal. This, I think, is just so like, whoa moment. On December 26th, after Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, they lowered the communist flag, the red flag with the symbol, the hammer and the sickle. They lowered that flag for the last time, and they raised up the new, well, not really new, it's actually the Russian flag from the pre-revolutionary era. So it's kind of like a momentous,
For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
So you get the idea. But yeah, I mean, like that was it. That was the end of the Cold War. So that is it for today's lecture. I really recommend this video clip. It goes over in like really succinct, clear, easy to understand way the fall of the Soviet Union, kind of reiterating some of the things I talked about in the lecture. But yeah, that is it for these lectures for right now. I look forward to seeing all of you in the Chapter 29 Zoom discussions later this week. On Friday, I'll have some more updates to give you about the AP exam. Then we'll be on spring break, and after that, we'll be reviewing for the exam. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.